to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Good afternoon. My name is Larry Jacobs. I'm Director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Just a couple quick piece of information for you as we move into today's program. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. That is your opportunity to become an important participant in today's discussion by submitting questions. You'll also see next to it, there is a live transcript button that gives you closed captioning if you would like that. I want to also just mention very briefly some of the exciting and important programs that we do have coming up. October 9th, we've got two terrific campaign consultants, Kirsten Kukowski, who's a high-level communications expert in the Republican Party, will join us along with Democratic strategist Rebecca Piercy, who runs campaigns all over the country and was Elizabeth Warren's campaign manager for a presidential campaign. So that's very exciting. Put that on your calendars. These two are terrific. They've done this with us a couple of times. They will be going through what they see happening in the campaign in the last few weeks. October 30th, we're delighted to have with us my colleague, Catherine Pearson, who is a Congress expert, and she will have along with her Professor Wendy Schiller from Brown University, who will be talking about what they see happening in congressional elections. So that is also an important program, and that is October 30th. Okay, well, let me quickly introduce to you the moderator and organizer of today's program, Chloe Thurston. Professor Thurston is at the Northwestern University, where she's an associate professor and a faculty fellow in the Institute for Policy Research. She received her bachelor's degree in economics and political science from Johns Hopkins University and a PhD in political science from University of California at Berkeley. She's written two fabulous books and a number of important journal articles. So we are in very good hands. Please welcome Chloe Thurston.
Great. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, thank you again, Larry, for for organizing this and inviting us to be here. And thank you, everybody, for being here today, to the audience and also to our distinguished panelists for joining. So just by way of introduction, obviously, we're just over a month away from what is looking to be, again, a very close presidential election. And one of the things that's come up repeatedly is about the role of voters of color in this coming election. Trump performed surprisingly well with voters of color in 2020, particularly, but not only among Latino voters. And there's been no coverage about these shifts. Over the last 4 years, polls and headlines have pointed to the continuation of what, while maybe not as large of a reorientation or realignment as some have suggested, still appears to be real and potentially durable. And of course, we know that in close elections, even small swings can be important. And beyond elections themselves, we know that it's valuable to understand these trends, what they might reveal about our own presumptions that we bring to these questions, and also the implications for how we think about American democracy and how we assess its quality more broadly. I'll say one thing about sort of what I brought to this or how I came to this. When I was in high school almost 20 years ago, John Judas and Roy Teixeira published a book called The Emerging Democratic Majority. And in that book, They made the case that an emergent coalition of professionals, of women and racial minorities would join with the Democrats' traditional blue-collar base, and that would propel a new and durable Democratic majority. And it had a very much, I remember at the time, the sort of democracy is destiny feel. The idea being that Black voters already had decades-long tie with the Democratic Party, were a traditional support base, and they would join with more recent immigrant groups who had come more recently to view the Democrats as the party that was more friendly towards immigrants. Latinos, with the exception of Cuban Americans in Miami, had generally been seen as moving towards the Democratic Party by this time. And Asian voters, too, had since the 1990s appeared to be shifting from trending Republican to Democrats. The 2008 coalition that brought Obama into office appeared initially to bear out some of these predictions. Obama won with 95% of the Black vote, 67% of the Latino vote, and 62% of voters who identified as Asian. Indeed, following Obama's reelection in 2012, the Republican National Committee commissioned its own autopsy report. And one of the things that they argued, too, was that in addition to other measures, the GOP should probably do more to appeal to younger and minority voters, again, in sort of recognizing this potential emerging coalition to make those voters feel more welcome in the party. In 2016, Trump took a somewhat different approach and did not quite live up to the heed the suggestions of the autopsy report. Yet, as I mentioned already, in his 2020 reelection campaign, Trump saw big gains among some groups of African American, Asian American, and Latino voters. And in the 4 years since, polling continues to suggest that non-white voters, at least among some groups, are becoming more open to conservatism as a movement and the Republican Party specifically. So, of course, this raises a lot of questions. It raises questions about the historical relationship between the Democratic and Republican parties and different groups of minority voters, about the scope and nature of change today, about how seriously we should take trends, how we should think about polls and their limits, and also about democracy more broadly, about the stakes for representation. Above all, what do we get wrong about this? So these questions are why I'm so excited to have our two panelists today, Daniel HoSang and Alvin Tillery, to join us for the conversation. Dan HoSang is a professor of American Studies and holds secondary appointments in the Department of Political Science and the Yale School of Medicine's section on the history of medicine at Yale University. He also serves on the Education Studies Advisory Committee, and he's an interdisciplinary scholar of racial formation and racism in politics, culture, and the law. Before joining Yale in 2017, HoSang was an associate professor and department head of ethnic studies and political science at the University of Oregon. HoSang received his BA in history from Wesleyan University and his PhD in American Studies and ethnicity from the University of Southern California. We're also joined by my colleague, who's just upstairs, actually, Dr. Alvin Tillery. Al is a professor of political science at Northwestern University. His research is in American politics. It focuses on racial and ethnic politics, American political development, and social movements. His research in political theory focuses on American political thought, on critical race, and also on critical race theory. And he's published widely, including in the American Political Science Review, Studies in American Political Development, Political Research Quarterly, and the Journal of Black Studies, among other prominent journals. We should also note that Professor Tillery is the founding director of the Center for the Study of Diversity and Democracy, also at Northwestern University. Al and Dan, thank you again for being here. So I wanted to set the stage first by thinking a bit about the history, sort of our common conceptions about how we think about voters of color and sort of the issues that come along with characterizing groups or blocks of voters in certain ways, and what you guys think people get wrong. So Al, I wanted to start by asking you to say more about the historical development of Black voters' relationship to the Democratic Party. What factors help to explain this? And also, how might this history and set of ties be distinctive from other groups of non-white voters in the United States?
Wow, so three big questions off the bat. Okay, so I think the conversation about the evolution of party alignment with Black voters has to track with the conversation about the racial dictatorship that characterized Black life from 1619 to 1968, right? And so the reality is that, Black voters in the modern era, the post-civil rights era, their partisanship has been shaped by the legacy of the movement out of racial dictatorship, out of Dixie, as one of our colleagues would have described it, right? Rob Mickey at Michigan, into a kind of modern, functional, democratic order, which frankly they built. They built with allies like labor unions and, progressive white reformers, many located in the Republican Party in the northern states. But the federal government was at the center of it all. And so the partisanship conversation in terms of attachments that Black people formed were mostly about very limited options, right? So for most of the history of Black voting, when you go back to the 15th Amendment in 1870, one of the two major parties was arrayed against the prospect of Blacks voting, right? So back then, Blacks were Republicans because the Democrats were the party of the Ku Klux Klan, right? And that pretty much stayed the case in terms of Black partisan alignment until the middle of the 20th century, right? With the rise of the Roosevelt administration and the modern civil rights movement, we began to see shifts. But, when I think about the Black folks that raised me, my great aunts and uncles whose parents were slaves, right? Like they thought of themselves as Republicans until 1960 with John Kennedy's election. And so my very close uncle, I used to spend summers on his farm, his name was Theodore Roosevelt Carter, right? So there was a very strong attachment. But that kind of migration, really occurred with the election of 1960 when Dr. King endorsed Kennedy, and we began to see a rapid shift. We also began to see the people who were formerly the very committed segregationists in the Democratic Party, people like Strom Thurmond and others, they became the Change Party affiliation in the 1980s. They became Republicans, right? And so, we get a real shift to Blacks identifying with the Republican Party with the administration of Lyndon Johnson, who signed all those great civil rights bills of the 1960s, with, the kind of efforts of people like Fannie Lou Hamer and Jesse Jackson and others to really modernize the selection process and give Blacks a seat in the Democratic Party, the McGovern-Fraser reforms of 1972. So all these things in the 60s and 70s crystallized around the fact that the action for Black folks was on the Democratic side. And then Reagan came along and courted all of the former Dixiecrats by doing things like going to Neshoba County, Mississippi, where Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were killed, and giving a famous speech about states' rights, and talking about how we would put Clarence Thomas at the EEOC to defund it. And so, once again, Blacks found themselves in a position where really only one of the two major parties wanted their vote. And in the modern era, that was the Democratic Party. Our colleague Paul Freimer calls that capture. So Blacks have been captured their entire history in the electorate by one party or the other. So.
Thanks, Al. That's a great, it was a very long question. And so thank you for the history of realignment and also changing partisan commitments, as well as the sort of role of the changing federal government's commitment towards civil rights, at least among the Democratic Party at the time. Dan, in order to also sort of set the stage in this other set of questions, which has to do with how we think about groups themselves. I know we've established that African Americans as a group tend to vote in similar ways, as Alice pointed out. Much of this has to do with a sort of a structurally constrained position within American politics vis-a-vis the two-party system. But what I was wondering from you, because your work is to understand how voters of color have forged some ties with the conservative movement and right-leaning candidates, and how this complicates the idea that we can speak about voters of color as a group, at least more beyond African-American voters. I'm going to include with this question a couple of questions that came from some of our audience members ahead of time that, again, I think get to this question about how we think about groups and clustering. So one audience member asks, is clustering voters by race even that useful? Hispanic voters whose families came to America 2 or more generations ago are politically indistinguishable from white voters. Another audience member writes, how accurate is polling by race when there is ever increasing diversity among individuals and racial groups? So I would love to hear your response to these questions about sort of context and sort of group specificity in light of your own experience and work on these issues.
Sure. Okay. Well, thanks, Chloe. Hi, Al, and everyone. It's really, it feels like an opportune and important time to dig into these questions together. And I very much appreciate the history Al laid out. And I want to maybe just offer to kind of build on that a little bit, and then to offer as my own point of entry. For the last 4 or 5 years, I've been part of a collaborative project on what we're calling the politics of the multiracial right. And here I would say not just voters, but it's actually how many of the alignments and formations that Al described so carefully have reached this kind of point of, I don't know that I would use the word realignment, suggests that it's a neat kind of shifting from one partisan identification to another. I think, there's also this term de-alignment, which means that it's not just taking one form the way we've thought about historical cycles. And I'll say a couple of things about that. One is that the history that Al just recited for us also produced a set of assumptions, and I might even say stereotypes, about people of color in general and Black people in particular on the right. That to identify as conservative, one would be deracialized. In other words, say, I believe in a kind of post-racial moment. Not bear like kind of false consciousness that they're being duped or manipulated, or they're being kind of instrumentalized. There's personal gain at the sacrifice. I think there's lots of figures we can point to that bear those politics. So I don't want to say that's there's no underlying material truth to that. But I think what it doesn't account for, and certainly in the movement we've seen really, I would say across the last 20 years, 2 things. One is that there are a growing number of people who don't see a contradiction between kind of asserting their own racial consciousness and cultural identity in clear terms. So this is not longing for whiteness or, a kind of mixing pot. They inhabit it fully, and suggesting that they have critiques of liberalism and liberal politics, such that they are at best ambivalent and often, feel those critiques have sent them to looking for kind of new other areas. I'll also say that the Black political tradition Al's describing, it maintained many of those critiques. It had strong critiques of racial liberalism, its limits, the ways liberals themselves often reproduced hierarchy from the start. So these are not just, external, and they spread across many groups. The second is that during the time that, the kind of, my colleague Joe Lowndes described it as Goldwater to Atwater, kind of the late 60s to the late 80s. The Republican electoral strategy was very specifically focused on disidentifying with voters of color, right? In the early 60s, Republicans voted roughly half and half for that Civil Rights Act Al mentioned. For the next 20 to 30 years, if all the political campaigning was like, we want the Democrats to be identified with minoritized interests because that will give us electoral advantage with these white voters. They were explicit about it, and we see the Willie Horton ad, all of these examples. They are the party of the other. That actually, and there's elements to be sure, and you can see it, there. I'm not suggesting in any way it's disappeared, but there is more interest among many conservative formations in actually competing for and winning the identification of people of color. And this takes many, many forms, and that they're no longer, their repertoire used to just be colorblindness, we don't see race, right? We're past race, or stigmatization. Or demonization, right? You're the problem, right? We're going to have at you. Those are not the only 2 notes that you're seeing. And I would say this in terms of movements against reproductive rights, movements around immigration restriction, movements around educational equity, around how people navigate healthcare and other systems. In other words, they can say, we're going to make an argument to people of color that conservative and right-wing solutions speak to their material lives in ways that liberals don't. They never really would have done that in any significant form years ago. The last just quick thing I'll say is that I think that, you know, the variables and data we typically look at, party registration, polling data, presidential election especially, as proxies or expressions for a kind of neat understanding of people's politics or ideology, those matter still, and you know, we need to, you know, take that into account, but they're not the only sites. And they're often, I would say, downstream from other forces that are shaping people's sense of their political allegiances and worlds. So I think we need kind of more tools in our repertoire to understand what's happening, especially because there's so much variation between, let's say, Mexican Americans in South Texas and what's happening there, Black men in the Midwest, Indian Americans and the kind of movement of the Hindu right. Lots of things happening, and just the kind of when it shows up in the polling, it's long after, I think, other forces have been at work on people.
Thanks, Dan. I'm wondering if you would mind elaborating a little bit on that last point, just because it sort of speaks to the project that you've been involved in the last 4 years that you mentioned before with Joe Lowndes. And also because, you know, part of that project has entailed you actually going and talking to people who have participated in these movements. So what have you learned by speaking to minority voters who are aligning themselves with the conservative movement, finding them, you know, you're talking to them in conservative spaces, and what sorts of either sort of critiques, you know, or ambivalence that you mentioned, you know, examples have you seen that stuck out for you and that, you know, we should think more about?
Yeah, maybe I'll just share a couple of stories, and this is by no means kind of a systematic survey, and so I don't want to, I want to be cautious about saying how generalizable it is. But, you know, my colleague Mike English and I went to the Trump rally in the South Bronx in May, and people may remember, you know, progressive figures like AOC said, you know, the only one that's going to show up to that are kind of Trump brothers, Trump bros from Long Island and New Jersey, right? It's just a dupe. You know, we got there, there's thousands of multiracial working class New Yorkers. I'm not suggesting it's representative in any way of the broader electorate, or that New York City or the state would somehow, you know, significantly sway. But when you talk to people there, one, it's not like people are like, they switched their registration long ago and now they're fully on. What they talk about constantly is their deep ambivalence and mistrust of these systems in general. You see a wide range of issues from, you know, concern about never-ending wars to, you know, meeting basic needs for working class people. So this general sense that like things are broken, and at least I'm going to like see where this, you know, kind of project goes. And I think it's important because it reveals that conservatives who had long thought themselves as protectors of a certain kind of status quo, right, keeping at bay the insurgents, that has really flipped. They understood there that to identify as conservative or to kind of identify in some way with Trump was to be insurgent. It was to be standing outside systems of power, collapsing systems of power that people no longer trust. So, and that's why de-alignment for me matters. You know, I think for many of them, and when we're in spaces listening to conservatives color talk, they also have critiques of the Republican Party, its history of racism, figures in it that continue to spout nativists. They have no illusions about that. But their sense that the kind of liberal project and solutions has collapsed is partly what brings them there. The last quick thing I'll say is we also went to a Turning Point USA. It's a large, kind of pretty far right youth organization. And I was, you know, they did work. They have a America Fest every year, 13,000 people in Phoenix. And they had these two young Latino organizers talking about their strategies in a small number of swing precincts in 5 states. And part of what they said is, look, there are voters of color who just Republicans never tried to talk to. But they said, take our word for it. They are ready for new conversations. We can't assume automatically, but if we make our events fun and connecting to cultural norms and bouncy houses and parks and tamale parties and, you know, Tucson, we can make connections with them. So that sense that there's an opening and a rupture and new possibilities are in place is part of what we continue to hear.
Thanks, Dan. So Al, this Dan's sort of observations about some of the limits of sort of how we typically look in the data, how we typically sort of, survey populations, I think speaks to some of the limits that you've spoken to as well, in terms of conventional polling outlets. And so I wanted to ask you a kind of similar question to Dan's in the sense of, I'm ultimately really interested in what you think people today get wrong too. But I also wanted to frame yours in terms of polling. This finding of eroding Black voter support for Democrats to some extent, and sort of the growing appeal or curiosity among conservative politicians has been prominent across a number of polls. I think the New York Times Siena poll is the one that we always hear the most about. These polls, though, do sample a broader electorate and then look specifically at Black respondents, within those samples. And one of the things that I think is really, informative and illuminating about your work is that your polling is focused specifically on Black voters. I believe you've polled, 20,000 over the last few months?
30,000 now.
30. Well, thank you. It's probably going to be 40 by the end of this conversation too. But so I'd love for you to say a bit more about this. Why it's important. Why you think it's important to have polling that's specific to the demands and sort of desires of Black voters. And again, along with the sort of question that I asked Dan, what have you learned from this that you think people get wrong? What do pollsters today get wrong, in your opinion? What do you think maybe prominent Democrats misunderstand about their own coalition?
Oh boy.
Sorry, I keep giving you these 5-part questions.
Yeah, I'll try not to be as long-winded as the first. So the first thing I want to say, as you know, Chloe, and I hope this is okay for the Minnesota, but I am a Democratic pollster. So I do polling for causes and campaigns. And I was chuckling because the Times Siena poll, we gave the Biden campaign and White House, those data, 6 months earlier. And what's funny is that they refused to believe that they were losing support with Black and Latino voters, particularly, men. And so, I think, I think Dan's work is really impressive. I love the way that you have the courage and the fortitude to go out there and talk to people in these sites. And, I can't wait to read more about what you all are up to. I read your really informative piece. I think it was in the Atlantic about the swing districts. And so I think that, that work is fantastic. From my standpoint, what's wrong with the polls isn't that they miss the subtlety that Dan and Joe and your co-authors are taking up. I think that kind of work that you're doing, we're going to be learning from that for a decade and really teasing that out. My problem is that the polls have mostly been bad in the fact that they don't survey enough people of color or young people. So the Times Siena poll, they're surveying 300 people, they're waiting, it's got 30 or 40 Black folks, 20 Latinos, 5 Asians. And so you're just getting a very, they would have come to the recognition in that poll, and that's a tracking poll, just like the one that my company, 2040 Strategy Group, runs. They would have come to that recognition last fall if they were doing what we do, which is samples of 3,000, 4,000. And we also expose people to randomized control message tests, right? So, what we've been finding is that, yes, support is eroding, but it's much more because of the frustration that Black voters have with the Democratic Party than with some allure of Donald Trump or some allure of conservatism writ large. And I think that the effect in our data is mostly driven by the fact that young, half the electorate, 50% of the Black voting age population is under 35, right? So, I started my narrative out by talking about my great aunts and uncles and staying on their farms. They were all born in the 1880s. their parents were slaves. Like, I have narratives of slavery and Jim Crow and all that. I integrated my neighborhood. I'm a lynching survivor. Like, I remember the bad old days of race relations. The people that are driving the effect of the erosion of Democratic support, they typically are low information, low income, shift workers who live in, mostly all Black neighborhoods, or, if there are minorities there, other groups there, that they're Blacks, I'm sorry, Latinos and Asians. They don't really see or know white people very well, and they don't remember the 1960s and what the Democrats did for them. What they remember is that, everyone told them to vote for Joe Biden because Trump was bad for them and dangerous. And there were a bunch of promises made about Voting Rights Act renewal. And, that's important because some of those people stood in line for 5, 6, 7 hours. They remember the promises about the George Floyd Act. They remember promises about student loan debt, or sort of forgiveness. And what they say in our polls is like, none of that stuff has come to fruition. So, what we call the new Black swing voters in our work, the swing is not necessarily from the Democrats to Trump. It's much more between voting for the Democrats or staying at home on the couch. But there is a kind of stable baseline of 8, 9, 10% in our samples that say, yeah, like, Trump's funny. I got that stimmy from him, professor, the stimulus check, right? Or, my favorite rapper loves him. Like, yeah, they're there. But you look at that 10% and you go back to when my uncle Theodore Roosevelt Carter started voting, right? Like, probably, even though most Blacks were voting Republican, like 25% were probably voting Democrat, 25%. You bring it up to when the realignment really shifted in the 1940s and 50s. I think Dwight Eisenhower got something like 32% of the Black vote, right? In his second time out, right? So, like, these realignments take a long time. What I see in the Black vote is nothing close to a realignment that we would have talked about in historical terms, right? The kind of secular 8 to 10%, it's probably normal. But I think people think it's not normal because Trump is such a vehement racist that it's really hard to understand why any person of color would pull the trigger for him, right? So, we look at what's happening with the Springfield, Ohio, Muslim bans, all the, so that's why it's so shocking. But it looks like a secular trend to me from the impact of a pollster, from the vantage point of my being a pollster. So.
Thanks. So one of the things that you mentioned, Al, that kind of stood out was when thinking about that 8 or 10% of voters, is that they seem to be kind of low attachment voters anyways. And so maybe voters who aren't changing their mind or aren't sort of moving from a really strongly held position, right, to a new one. I'm really curious, Dan, from your conversations, whether you're sort of seeing that too, whether sort of people have conversion stories, or it's more of stories of, this is just the first time I've felt sort of incorporated, which seem, to speak to slightly different types of impetuses that are attracting people to and away from different parties.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have a couple of thoughts on that, which is, one, in many ways, the multiracial right has also shaped the Democratic Party. And because Al is talking about, in some ways, some of the short-term kind of like policy proposals that circulate during the election that are not realized, but the broader sense that a kind of liberal solutions, let's say, to economic disparities, educational disparities, crises in healthcare, COVID, et cetera, have purchase and meaning, and people will identify and get excited about them. I think there's I don't know how this comes across in terms of your like age cohort data, But I think when we think about both age and kind of broadly class together, it's clear that younger voters, younger working class voters, voters that don't have college education, don't automatically say that I identify the Democratic Party as the party that has a program that will speak to my lived experiences. And you know, like, you go to a place like Turning Point USA, where you will hear from the stage, even though there's a large number of people of color who are also on the stage, there's also a surprising number of just young folks of color around. And their on-ramps to these right-wing spaces are sometimes through evangelical churches, sometimes through its appeals around kind of gender and sexuality, and homophobia and transphobia. Sometimes it's just some sense that, like, the Democratic Party is associated with a certain kind of status quo staleness. And even if it's not, I mean, you'll often hear in these conservative spaces deep criticisms of establishment Republicans, you know, whether they call them rhinos or, so the kind of what they're trying to build on the right is a kind, I mean, we may call it populist, but they're trying to capture that energy that's deeply frustrated and feels, you know, ambivalent about prevailing solutions. So, you know, and one would, like, sometimes people say, well, what would those people, you know, after hearing Trump's speeches on immigration and how, you know, derogatory they are, what would someone be doing there? I think we could ask the same question about, well, why would they automatically be identifying as Democrats? The Harris campaign is arguably to the right of where, let's say, Reagan was around immigration. There's not a clear, you know, beyond money for HBCUs agenda around racial justice, around taking these things on. So, like, I don't experience it as, like, the way I think generations ago, someone saying, like, what are you doing here? Have you lost your senses? This is not where you belong. There's a better place for you. Because I think they're like, well, I'm ambivalent about the other place. And the last thing I'll say is that these right-wing groups are deeply attentive to the alienation, loneliness, and cynicism that many people feel. I'm struck, it's not often policies they're saying. They are not giving anyone Milton Friedman in these youth things, Ayn Rand, or here's the benefit of a tax cut. I don't think, there's no conservative solutions that I think people really want to hear about, but they are giving them connection and fun and some sense of, like, an acknowledgement of the banality of politics. And so I just want to say that's what I mean about those things are upstream from this, that the right is not just, I think we have this, like, sense that, like, oh, they're probably trying to, you know, register Republican voters around the GOP platform. That's not what's happening in many right-wing spaces. They are trying to capture that energy around disaffection, identity, et cetera, and steer it towards the right. And I will oftentimes be listening to right-wing podcasts kind of from the left, and I'll go, you know, 20 minutes, and I'll say, actually don't disagree with any of the analysis there about the failure of the electoral system, the failure of, you know, public health systems to meet people's needs, et cetera. When they get to the solutions, I disagree. But I'm saying they're naming material conditions that people are trying to navigate in ways they hadn't done before.
Al, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't disagree with that, but I do think that, you know, those spaces are, I mean, they are intentionally designed to be purveyors of disinformation, right? So the fact that they, you know, like, you know, I'm involved in a super PAC effort, you know, this cycle as well. So, like, one ad that we've been mulling over is, you know, Charlie Kirk from the Turning Points USA conference getting up and talking about, you know, overturning the Civil Rights Act. It's time, right? So, like, okay, like, and a kind of way that they frame it is, you know, this makes us all equal, right? Like, so the young Black conservatives in the crowd and the young white folks in the crowd, you'll all be equal when we get rid of the protections of the Civil Rights Act, right? And so, like, the Democrats can't really counter that, right? In the sense, if that low information voter is going to bite on that, like, what is the response to that, right? And so that's where I think the reference to historical memory that I'm making is the gap. But Dan, I totally agree. Like, part of the reason folks are most susceptible to that kind of disinformation is because the Democrats have run away from their role as the supposed defenders of minority rights. I mean, you know, Harris is not doing very well right now, right? And I think my polls show a big part of that. is because she's not offering young voters of color anything that differentiates her from Trump. The only differentiation point from Trump is abortion, 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 right? Now, that is not going to do it if you're that young, Black male or Latino male voter working at Target, and your choice is staying at home or going to the polls, and you've not said anything to them about your plan. Right. And so I think that you're absolutely right, that it is a kind of move to point out how the institutions have eroded, largely because the Republican Party has started the erosion. But it's also a move to point out how facile and feckless the Democrats have been. And I'm a Democratic pollster. Again, we've got contracts in the field for active candidates right now. But let's just be clear on race and gender and many of these things. The Democrats have been, AWOL. And, these young folks are looking for cures to their loneliness, like Dan's talking about. They're looking for an ideology. They're looking for someone to help in these material circumstances. And the Democrats aren't providing any of that. I totally agree with that part of it.
Yeah. And if I could just, as one quick thing, part of what, it's absolutely right. And I'll just say, for example, at this turning point, there's a main stage where people like Charlie Kirk and, Tucker Carlson are saying the most thunderous, nativist, racist, demeaning comments, have babies, one to the clock. But you'll see also in their podcasts and their spaces, all of these other appeals that are actually quite attentive to the material conditions, let's say young women trying to navigate questions of healthcare and reproductive health and childbearing and career, that are, there absolutely is disinformation in there, but they are, part of what I've learned is they pay attention to exactly what Al is talking about. This is where they're not getting things from the progressives on the left, and this is where we can engage them. I would never suggest that they have a policy behind that'll really speak to those. But part of what, when I suggested on listening and like the analysis of the collapse of the institutions is not just fabricated. No. It's, when people say, look at the condition of our schools in many places, right? The efforts then to appeal to people, let's say around charters and vouchers, those are rooted in, for, families of color and students of color, their material experiences in public institutions. And I think their long-term objective is to really dismantle those institutions. Yeah. But they know the way to do that is not just to offer a philosophical comment about the role of government. It's to say, how did it feel to wait in line for 6 hours at the clinic? There. And that's where it's like, it was a good 6 hours. So I'm saying, I think there's this thing like, well, they don't really mean it, so we can just discount it. And that's just not true. They're attentive. That these are what people are navigating in their real lives.
I have to say, so this has been a great exchange. It's kind of touched on a bunch of different themes that I wanted to tease out too. One about sort of age and generation, right? And there seems to be, especially among younger voters, as you've mentioned, both of you, the sense that sort of policy itself or sort of political parties are not speaking to citizens' lived experiences in a way that really, speaks to them and motivates them to have any real sense that of who they should support and why, at least in a material sense. The other thing that comes out here too, though, and that I think both of you have spoken to in different ways, is the relationship between historical memory, social institutions. We know historically social institutions like churches help to sort of keep memories of, say, Black churches in the civil rights movement and the sort of role of the Democratic Party in civil rights expansion, sort of in the consciousness of the folks who are attending those institutions. I am really curious here about how you see social institutions having changed over time and what the implications of those are, both for sort of the erosion of of traditional sources of support for political parties. Again, I'm thinking about African Americans, the Black Church, and the Democratic Party, but also how new types of social institutions might be emerging to fill some of these spaces and what the implications are of those. And this is a question for both of you. So whichever of you would like to start first, maybe Al, since Dan just had the last word. Al's laughing. Go.
Okay, yeah, thanks for another stumper. But no, I mean, I think you know you're on to something big. So I referenced the generational divide. And let's be clear, like my prediction is that the soft support that Harris has among millennial and Gen Z Black and Latino men is likely going to cost her the election, right? And so you know, what's happening there is that you know, and I was chuckling because of the Times Siena poll when we'd been giving the campaign similar data since last fall. So why didn't the campaign believe us? Well, because we're just a bunch of random pollsters who also have academic jobs. That's one reason. But, you know, but another reason is, you know, there's an entire network of professional Black politicos that are elected officials. They are largely the same age as the POTUS. And, you know, they say to him when faced with a new set of data that the numbers are soft with young Black folks, don't worry about it, Joe. Like everybody in my church is going to vote for you. I don't know what's this 2040 strategy group talking about, like, right? Or, and then when, you know, VP Harris replaced President Biden at the top of the ticket, it's like, okay, the numbers haven't changed. It's like, what are they talking about? Like, she's Black and Asian. Everybody's going to rally to her, right? But now there is a sense of alarm. You may have noticed, and maybe if you're not an operative, you don't watch these things like I do, but like 3 weeks ago, the campaign told their top donors that it's time to give to super PACs, to independent expenditure committees, because the numbers were not moving in the right direction with Black, Latino voters. And so, you know, that's kind of an admission that the traditional GOTV isn't working. So why? Why isn't the traditional GOTV working? It's not working because that 50% of the Black electorate that's under 35, and it's even a higher percentage, like 60 for the Latino electorate, they don't go to church in the way that their parents went to church. So like, you know, 40% of Black Americans don't go to church very, very often or at all anymore. And so the churches are not these automatic, disciplined GOTV machines like they had historically been. The second dilemma is you've got an aging leadership at all of these 501c3 organizations. You know, love them all, but, you know, when we run our polls, many people don't know who Reverend Sharpton or Mark Morial or whoever's leading UNIDO, like they don't know who these people are. And so when you know, 20 years ago, we could have said, you know, Mark Morial is supporting Kamala, right? That would have been like a really big deal to Black voters. Now it's like, okay, like what's his Insta feed? Like, how can I learn more about Mark Moore? You know, and so like that's the dilemma. And then the third thing, which I'll layer on, is exactly what Dan's talking about. The other side has found a way to purvey their disinformation on social and in these other ways that is really persuasive to people that are no longer participating in the two main mechanisms, churches and 501c3s, that used to turn out the Black and Latino vote. And so, but for me, what we get in our surveys is not that the reason these young people are not going to the NAACP meeting and the churches anymore. In our surveys, it shows that like, because they see those organizations as too conservative and too ineffectual. So
I think I would underscore all of that. You know, before academia, I worked as an organizer in California in the 1990s. And some people remember this is a time of these ballot propositions, dismantling affirmative action, around immigration, bilingual education, et cetera. At that time, for example, and it was much more of a contested, Republicans held the governorship, the 90 statewide offices. To talk to a voter of color, you would just say two things. Pete Wilson, who was the governor at the time, the Republican governor, supports your opponent. For Latino voters, that's all you need to say, right? He stood in unproblematically for nativism, discrimination, et cetera, and they weren't trying to, do anything about that. And you could just say, Dolores Huerta, the farm workers, as Al said, you could just put a proxy in, but that's based on a presumption that people have an identification with that person, right? And that's just how it would work. They would just churn out ad after ad. And I think what we're exploring here is that the underlying kind of infrastructure of that has now waned. So people are not getting frameworks of interpretation, right? How to make sense of the world at churches, at their labor unions, and certainly not at the parties themselves. So I think for the conservative groups, they don't need to actually win people over to any policy agenda into there. They need to just get people cynical enough to say, this is why I kind of don't trust anyone or anything, either because they won't vote as frequently. But that also, I think ultimately their interests lie in the dismantling of any kind of collective democratic institutions that hold, private and often predatory interests to account. So once people are just confused and ambivalent, that's the conditions through which they can work. Does that make sense? You don't have to get them behind a particular project. So that's really what I see. And, I think as Alice said so clearly, there's not something on the other side that can balance that. And the right also very much knows the dynamics Alice is describing, which is those supporters, they think they're far more solidified than they actually are. And so, it's just that sense that they're deeply attentive to all of these contradictions.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned sort of, one way to one almost tact is just sort of if you generate confusion or sort of make voters more cynical. That's kind of one way to achieve some goals. But some of your writing also speaks to what seem like some genuine policy appeals as well for some conservatives, conservatives of color, Dan, or at least the sense that maybe some policymakers believe that would be the case. And I'm thinking, I'm looking here at a question that we received from an audience member who mentions that the Democratic Party has very close ties with teachers' unions and asks, to what extent does the Republicans' party advocacy of school choice appeal to Black voters with children? So, I'm wondering in terms of, that's sort of one possible policy sort of issue, but we can think of others. And to what extent do you think that the appeal of certain policies plays a role, if any, in shaping sort of positive attitudes or attachment towards conservative causes, and maybe sort of drawing voters away also from, or repelling voters from democratic politics as well?
I would just say, I think it's an important question. I would, maybe frame it as, rather than just policies, like thinking people are like these just market, actors who are choosing, but like where their interests, I think it's in relationship to their material experiences. So the last 40 years has also been a collaboration between many Democrats and the entirety of the Republican Party in defunding public institutions, schools, protections in relation to the environment, on and on healthcare. So people's lived experience with those institutions is often deeply frustrating. And I think that really got accentuated during the pandemic closures. There's like no one looking out. So they kind of remove, take, starve. And then they say, look at these special interests protecting this broken system. Now, many people have, and the surveys bear this out, it's hard to get people mad at your local elementary school because even if you're frustrated by it, you kind of recognize the good work there. But if you can just get people to think in general, like, do you think that they're looking out for you in some ways? I think it's easy to deepen people's cynicism that way. And I think that in some cases, then that means drawing people into projects like vouchers, although it's interesting how consistent, I mean, that they've made so many efforts to do that, and how ambivalent people often are about that. I would say the same thing for nativist appeals to Black voters. Again and again, the right has tried to say to people, look, if we engage mass deportations, you'll get jobs back. And there's been a political sophistication that's like, I recognize this, where it's coming from. But again, that just sense of like, if it feels chaotic, if you're in, I don't know, blue New York City, and you're just tired of like subway trains breaking down and some, like things being crowded, it's just enough to erode. So it's not even, again, another kind of policy. It's just, I think, taking away from people's sense that like there is a collective solution to this problem.
Al, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So we run the same 15 items on our tracking poll every month, and immigration it typically is like 13th or 14th for Black voters. Black voters are, but that doesn't mean you can't find the person that's claiming that some migrant killed their child, or that's there. Black people can be nativist. It's there, but it's a very low register in terms of issue attention in our surveys of Black voters. So I agree with that completely.
So we're running towards the end of our time, and I had two remaining questions. One stands out a lot to me, and maybe I'm wrong for picking up on this at all, but gender and sort of Dan, in a lot of your work and work with Joe too, when you're talking to people at these rallies or sort of who are aligned with different types of movements, a lot of them are male. It might be just an artifact of where you're going, or just something that, again, maybe I as a reader am just reading into. Al, one of the things that your polling has found is 40% of young men ages 18 to 22 are maybe or what you would call the new potential Black swing voter, right? 16% of women, I think. And so, I'm really curious as to whether, what either of you might say about what role gender, if any, if we're even able to really answer that question right now, also plays in these changes over time.
Yeah, well, in the Black community and the Latino community, women are just more informed and smarter typically. And they are also the super mobilizers of these communities. So there's that, which probably leads to a higher baseline. But then on top of that, what we've seen from the registration numbers, and we tested this recently, is that a lot of these young women of color are inspired by the idea that there will be a woman of color in the White House. And that's leading particularly some of the Latinas to overlook their stark policy differences with Harris being too far to the right, as Dan, for their own ideological, perspective. That's not happening with the young men. And that's what we haven't found this kind of wellspring of misogyny in the Black community that people always point to. In fact, one of the polls that put us on the map as professionals is that we ran a poll that found that something like 85% of Black men in 2020 were super excited that Kamala Harris was the vice president, right? Or the vice president nominee. So that's what I think. I think it's just kind of a role modeling effect is driving up the Black and Latino women in ways that it's not for the men in those young generations.
I agree with all that. The gender gap actually cuts across, I think, all racialized groups. I think appeals on the basis of gender and also appeals to homophobia, sometimes transphobia, kind of are playing out in different ways at different sites. One just part I want to say about this is that on the right, there is a growing sense that the kind of manosphere, trad wife, turn back the clock articulation of gender politics has limits for many young women who might otherwise, again, not identify with Democrats. So there's been an upsurge of attention there to trying to appeal to questions around health and food and relationships to pharmaceuticals and doctors as well, that are, again, are the kind of real material experiences and are not kind of like the way we would have heard in earlier conservative gender politics, even from conservative women, about they still have in them criticisms of feminism, of many of the gains of kind of like contemporary liberal civil rights, but again, the appeal is not about your rightful place in a kind of gender hierarchy as much as how you've been failed as young women by these prevailing systems.
Thanks. So we're at our last question, I think. We're at sort of a lightning round because we only have about a minute left, and I saved the biggest question. But I would love for each of you to just say a bit about what your work on these subjects sort of tells us or you about the status and quality of future of American democracy. How should we reassess our own understanding? What questions might we want to be asking, or what developments should we be attentive to as citizens?
The ship is going down if we lose this election. That's just, I just think that part of the reason we need to pay attention to young Black and Latino men, young men in general, on the Democratic side is not just to get Kamala Harris in the White House, but it's like, if they're 18 and this is their first time voting, and if they either vote independent or vote Republican, that's going to be a stamp. We know that from the social science, right? And so it's just going to make it harder for Democrats to win. And for all their flaws, Democrats are still team democracy. And, so for me, this is kind of like, we got to draw a line here.
Thanks. Dan?
I'll just say quickly, yeah, I would never want to diminish the consequences of this election and the threats to public institutions and democratic norms. I'll also say that that threat is made possible by a long-term deterioration of those norms and practices. So in my state, in many states, right, like large numbers of local and statewide offices essentially go uncontested. So when we appeal to people to protect democracy, their own lived experience with actually feeling like they have agency and they're involved in governance has long deteriorated. Both parties have played a role in that. So regardless of the outcome of this election, those institutions need to be transformed. And, many public teachers say we need to protect and transform. We need to protect our institutions from these efforts to dismantle them, but we can't defend a kind of status quo that's like on its own kind of
life support,
last breath. So yeah.
Well, on that note, Daniel, HoSang, and Al Tillery, thank you so much for a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.